Now it's time for RTB 101, where we discuss practical questions to help equip you to share your faith more effectively. And here to help me talk about a very important question about the first humans is my colleague, Dr. Fazale Rana. Welcome, Fuzz.
Krista, how are you doing?
Well, we are surviving the virus
Yeah,
and
we
we are
are.
grateful for technology so that the show can go on.
Yes, we sure are.
Now, one of the distinguishing features of our testable creation model strategy at Reasons to Believe is that we think about the first humans in a very specific way. Maybe we could start by having you summarize the position that we take about Adam and Eve. What is the biblical evidence that leads us to believe that they were, in fact, the first humans?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Krista, at Reasons to Believe, we take the view that Adam and Eve were the first human beings created uniquely in God's image, and that all humanity comes from Adam and Eve. And we would argue that this view is a view that is consistently taught throughout the totality of Scripture, the Old and the New Testament. So, for example, when you look at the Genesis 2 creation account, it's very clear to me when you read that account that Adam and Eve are being depicted as the first human beings. The genealogy in Genesis 5, which goes from Adam to Noah, clearly indicates that all humanity comes from Adam, and that the image of God that Adam was created to possess is transferred through reproduction to all of his descendants, as well as the effects of original sin. We go to Luke, the genealogy in Luke, which is Jesus's genealogy. It traces back to Adam, and this is significant because it's telling us that Jesus represents every human being in Adam in that sense. And of course, the Apostle Paul in Romans and in First Corinthians talks about Jesus as the second Adam, comparing Jesus's life, death, and resurrection to Adam's rebellion against God, where Jesus undoes the damage that Adam caused, where Adam, because of his rebellion, had the consequences of his sin impact all humanity, and the consequences of Jesus, again, crucifixion and resurrection from the dead, undoes the damage that all human beings suffer from. So the biblical text is very clear, I think, that there was a historical Adam and Eve that gave rise to all humanity, and that this is central to key doctrines in the Christian faith.
That's a really good overview of the biblical evidence for believing that Adam and Eve were the first pair. Now I wonder if we can kind of switch the conversation a little bit and looking at the scientific evidence. Are there reasons to believe that Adam and Eve were the first, in fact, genetic pair, that they were really our true genetic ancestors?
Yeah, and what we mean when we say that Adam and Eve are our genetic ancestors is this idea that that human beings, anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, all come from Adam and Eve, and that when they were created to be genetically distinct, genetically unique compared to every other creature that existed, including hominins such as Neanderthals. And so everybody that is genetically in Adam bears that unique genetic fingerprint that identifies them as a human being. And we would argue that there is nothing in the scientific evidence that suggests that there could not have been a primordial pair from which all humanity emanates. And of course, you've got these very provocative concepts like mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam that suggest, at least with regard to certain genetic markers, that we can trace an origin of humanity back to single individuals, a single female and a single male individual. Now, are these the biblical Adam and Eve? I think that could be debated, but it's very clear that you can show genetically that it's possible to trace humanity's origin back to single individuals.
I think that's a really helpful explanation. And I know that this is an area that, in general terms, we as old Earth creationists actually agree with young Earth creationists that Adam and Eve were the first pair. But I also know that there's alternative scenarios that are being put forth by some Christians as a different scenario where Adam and Eve were not necessarily our genetic ancestors. Maybe you can tell us about those ideas.
Yeah, and one of the things that is part of the controversy about Adam and Eve relates to the genetic variability of people alive today. And the claim is that the genetic variability of people alive today is too great to come from two individuals. Therefore, there must have been a population of human beings at the very onset. There could never have been an original pair. Now, we dispute that assertion at Reasons to Believe, but that is a common assertion. And so therefore you see three distinct approaches that people take to try to work around that particular issue. One is to argue that maybe Adam and Eve were not real individuals, instead that they were mythical or that they were theological constructs, and that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are really mythology, not historical or not scientifically accurate, but mythical, where they are communicating theological truths. Another approach is to say, well, Adam and Eve were historical, but maybe they were representatives that were part of this initial population that God then selected and placed in the Garden of Eden. And then a third approach that recently has gained prominence, though it's not necessarily a new approach, is to say, well, Adam and Eve are not our genetic ancestors, but instead were our genealogical ancestors, where we would trace our origins back to this couple that were our genealogical ancestors, just like we would trace our family tree back to our, distant ancestors who would have lived in the past. That would be the patriarchs and the matriarchs of our family. So those are the three different approaches, but the key point here is they all are motivated by this attempt to try to reconcile this claim that the genetic variability of humanity is too great to come from two individuals.
Now, with those alternative scenarios that are being proposed by some Christians, what do you see as some potential biblical or scientific obstacles to those alternative theories?
Well, for example, I don't think it's a great maneuver to claim that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are not scientifically or historically accurate, that they're mythical. Because once you do that, you now have completely eroded the foundation of the Christian faith. Key doctrines of Christianity are embedded in those very important chapters, and you've completely undermined Christianity when you do that. Now, in terms of the representative view or the genealogical view, they both suffer from the same problem, and that is this. In both views, you have to have human beings that are exactly alike Adam and Eve in every sense of the word, physically and behaviorally, but yet those individuals would not bear the image of God, and Adam and Eve would bear the image of God. And so this now creates some very troubling scenarios where you would have people that would be alive at different times in human history that wouldn't technically be image bearers, and that there's only a particular group of people that would bear God's image. And so this creates a lot of issues in terms of the dignity and the sanctity of all human life, but it also creates issues in terms of what do we mean by the image of God? How can we claim that everybody is an Adam in these kind of scenarios? And then finally, how do we understand the effects of the fall and the impact of original sin on all human beings in these kind of scenarios? So the theological issues are really quite significant when it comes to the genealogical view and the representative view.
Well, thanks for breaking all that down for us, Fuzz. And I do want to encourage our viewers to get connected with Fuzz's blog. It's called The Cells Design, and you can check that out on our website at reasons.org.